Hello there, and welcome to Weird Music on the Glumberger channel. This is of course a show where each and every week we take an album, have a discussion about it and talk about it and stuff, you know. So, in today's episode, we're going to be doing a sort of requested album, which comes from commenter Renato C. Francisco, a long-time supporter of the channel, I should add actually, so thank you very much for this one. So, I'll say here, in an effort to try get through requested albums, what I've essentially done is I've taken any album suggestion I could find in all the comments and I've thrown it all into a randomizer and going to try work through at least one a month if I can manage this. I'm going to try my best. It's going to be a very busy year, but we'll try our best. But anyway, this is the first one to come out the randomizer, so here we go. So, this album, this is one that I've listened to a lot since it was first recommended on the channel, and it's easily one of my favourite things I've been introduced to. It's so the music itself, not that weird. It's sort of weird in some respects, but the story behind it is very unusual, and there's a particular part that I find very interesting and peculiar, but more on that later. Let's just talk about it. Today I present the self-titled album, Rocks and Waves Song Circle. Right, so before we begin, let's of course ask the question, who are Rocks and Waves Song Circle? Well, here's the thing, I don't know. Okay, so as it turns out, nobody has any idea. This album release, it's one that's been put out into the world with essentially no information. There's no credits for this album, there's no list of performers, there's not even a list of instruments on this thing, no date, no location, just nothing. This album is essentially been presented to us in this incredibly minimal form, with the physical vinyl release featuring only the name of the group and the name of the album, of course, and a note saying songs 1 to 5. And on the record itself, you get the a logo for the record label, Bongo Joe. That is it. That is all you get when it comes to this album. So once again, all you can go on is this incredibly minimal information and, you know, literally what it is you're hearing. Right, so a little bit of fibbing there. To be fair, though, the Bandcamp page does tell us a little bit more about this strange album. To be fair, I think this is the only concrete piece of explanation for this album that there actually is. I've looked into this as much as I could, and there is just no information except this small little paragraph on the Bandcamp page. And usually when it comes to these things, I'll read it out much later in the video after we've discussed the album, but I feel like it's worth mentioning it now because it kind of gives a bit of context for what we're hearing essentially, and it will make sense to read it before rather than after. So this is the only literal information we have, and it goes as follows. This album is a mystery. The little we know about it is that an outsider Swedish artist named Isaac Sundström brought it back from Mexico in 2014 after having recorded it with a local choir and a Haitian soloist. They recorded together 5 of Isaac's compositions. We don't know the name and number of the person singing in the choir. We don't know how Isaac met those singers. We don't know how long he stayed there. The only thing we're sure of is that this album has a unique approach and sounds like nothing else. We could just try to describe it as a DIY gospel choir delivering a conscious message of love and unity. We could tell that the world needs to listen to this album for its infinite strength and universal power, released hand in hand with our soul brothers of Sing a Song Fighter. And so, we have a little bit of information. We have one lead, Isaac Sundstrom. So let's ask a different question, shall we? Who is Isaac Sundstrom? Well, Isaac Bjorn Ole Sundstrom is a musician, songwriter, author and artist from Sweden. And having started off as an author, it seems, having released books back in 2005 and 2008, I believe, they've since moved into music and have released a handful of different albums here and there, with a couple being released on Sing a Song Fighter, which was the very record label that this album we're looking at was co-released with. And so, as we've just been informed, Isaac Sundstrom is perhaps the band leader of this very strange little group indeed, a group with just one album under their name that is an incredibly intriguing and enigmatic mystery of music itself. Very peculiar, very weird, and all we've got to go on is this small amount of information and the music itself. So let's just dive into it then, shall we? And so, the album opens up with I, or One, alternatively known as Rocks and Waves according to both the Discogs page and the Sing a Song Fighter Bandcamp page. And so this is a perfect introduction for this entire album experience here. It opens up with these very abstract little openings of preparation from the unknown musicians, with voices speaking over each other as the guitar just twangs this beautifully precise tone, resonating in the very room itself before a great number of people vocalize wonderful undulating hums. And everything so slowly, so just patiently moves into position, introducing a tremendous musical palette that is really hard to discern the finer details of. But this is something we're going to realise with this album. And also that it's perhaps pointless to even try, if that makes sense. But as soon as the choir actually begins its wonderful vocal chant, that the whole thing just sets itself into motion, as though it's the very waves themselves just crashing up against the rocks. And I don't know about you, but I can't help but sway a little bit when I hear this one, you know? There's just this gorgeous presence to everything you hear that fills up your body with this really warm, rising energy, I find. And I have to say, I adore hearing all the many facets of the choir's voices. You got some deep, some high, some in the middle, but they all combine in this really peculiar celebratory sense of reaching out towards something much grander than itself. And what I adore, as some of you might be able to guess, is just the sound of all of these acoustic elements, you know, all coming together so effortlessly. Like when I hear this, I just get this sense of being in this hot, sweltering room in the middle of Mexico, as music just radiates from these very rooms, as the many members of the choir join their voices together to celebrate messages of love and unity. It is a truly astounding and beautiful opening track, and my goodness, what a thing to open up this album with. From there, we move on to track 2. Or as it's also known as We Trust in Defeat. And so I'd say this is probably one of the few proper song structured songs, if that makes sense. I think it'll make sense when you hear the whole thing. But for this one, you get so many lovely elements just all coming together though. There's this very gentle beat being established by the drum and bass at the very start that pushes it along, as the lead vocalist just takes it away with this really wonderful sounding voice, joined by a few of the backing vocalists as well. And, it's after this introductory verse, though, that more voices just join into the fray, and when they do, the whole song just expands outwards so beautifully, I must add. And it progresses, rather slowly, though, There's no sense of rushing or hurrying when it comes to these songs, and it's like they're just marvelling and revelling in delight of how all these voices, all these musicians, all these sounds are just combining these respective talents together in this really beautiful way, it feels. And I like on this one, you get really thrown deep into that sort of incredibly devotional, wholesome, and all around fascinating atmosphere that permeates throughout the entire recording, it feels, the entire album itself, you know. And the song structure, I'll say here, the song structure itself, I would argue it's somewhat simple, right? But there's something incredibly passionate and raw about the presentation of it. And as a result, it's, you know, it just strays away so far from simplicity, it feels, especially when the many voices all come together in it, and just makes it so astounding to hear. And as well, there's a wonderful build up to this. It's like the more it progresses, you know, it just becomes much more powerful, like the more and more it goes on, until by the very end, it's as though everybody in this room is just swaying in an ecstatic moment of delight. And you'll hear some members of that choir just vocalizing in such an expressive and free-form way, you know, alongside the continuing vocal refrains of trust in defeat and trust in the hope. And it gives this whole thing, you know, that, like I said, that lovely peculiar message of love, hope and solidarity that regardless of what happens to community and communities, you know, they're all standing together as one, if that makes sense. Before we stop talking about this one, there is one point I want to try and mention though. Probably should have mentioned the first song, but I think when it comes to this one in particular though, this is perhaps highlights the point I want to mention. I'll try my best with this. Bear with me here. So when it comes to this track and a couple of moments on some of the other songs, it feels like there's a couple of sort of awkward stumbles here and there, if that makes sense. You know, like the vocalist perhaps just tripping over, you know, the note ever so slightly, it feels. But weirdly enough, I find moments like this to be weirdly delightful. It gives the whole aesthetic of this album that sort of DIY sensibility, where perfection isn't the end goal of what we're going for here, but instead the presentation of something glorious and splendid. You know, those little faltering parts, it just feels really human to me, you know? An oddly delightful flaw that somehow adds much more character and depth to the whole thing that we're experiencing, and in a weird way, I would argue makes it better. Very weird to explain, I don't know if this is coming across well. It's definitely odd of me, but I just like it when things are just ever so slightly imperfect like this though, as it makes it just feel all the more real to me, if that makes sense. And there's something very special, you know, about the idea of a bunch of people coming together and singing and intertwining the many wonderful facets of their voices in the creation of something, which in this case is a very wholesome devotional album, and, you know, not caring about those sort of faltering moments, but just, you know, rejoicing in it, if that makes sense. Tricky for me to explain, but I'm hoping that makes some sense to some of you at the very least. Moving along though, we get to track 3, or Here We Come, which I would say is one of my favourites on this album as well. You just open up with this really beautiful solo vocal performance from who would I assume is the Haitian soloist, but I don't know for sure, to be fair. And their voice is just offset by these beautiful sounding instruments just gently droning away, you know, as their voice becomes backed up by these subtle little refrains from the other members of the choir, before they then just start singing this really beautiful lament, it feels. And what I love is in this one is those lovely droning layers from the instruments, you know, which I have no idea what they are because there's no listing of what the instruments are on this album, whatever. But they, you know, as they sort of, you know, create those layers, you know, the voices just climb and soar into it and just twist among themselves so beautifully, it feels. And you get this wonderful momentum to this one, where, you know, it's punctuated by the repeating chanting of Here We Come by the choir, which is cemented into the place by the thump of a drum, which leads the way for such a beautiful assortment of minimalist piano notes as you progress towards the end. I think it's so beautiful to hear. And across this whole album, The whole combination of everything coming together, the voices, the instruments, the pianos, the specifics of the vocal performances, including the choir and the lead vocals, and offset by that really gentle piano, just makes for one of the most sublime moments on this whole album, leading it towards this wonderful moment of love and unity, before it all so slowly and subtly just recedes back towards that silence once more. I think it's a truly beautiful song, and it works really well as a closer, as this is the song that ends the A side of this vinyl record. So following this, you flip it over, and you get the album's shortest track, and easily, probably, maybe arguably my favourite track on the whole thing, which is track 4, also known as Still and Radiant. So this one proceeds, so gently with this very calm piano melody, a sort of rattling of percussion, and then this rising build-up of vocal layers, which just goes and then stops. And it just lets the silence resound in the entire room for a brief moment before it just starts all over again. And there is such a presence to everything featured on this one, everything resounding in this wonderful, gorgeous way. And then the lyrics begin on this one. It's led mostly by this very lower sounding voice from one of the members. Don't know who it is, of course. But they just sing this lovely lament, and their singing is backed up by these rather unusual harmonies, I would say, from the rest of the choir, but it's so beautiful to hear. But what I love on this one is that gentle stop-start momentum you get, and what I would argue is the chorus of it, but maybe who knows. And what you get with it is this wonderful waltzy nature to the composition that just feels like dancing with a loved one, where you're just spinning and twirling, completely lost within your own world, as the music just continues to play all around you, it feels. And so weirdly enough, every single time I hear this particular track, and I've listened to this one a lot as well, but I'm always reminded of the scene from Cinderella when herself and the prince are just dancing with each other at the royal ball. I don't know why, but it's just the exact image I have of just dancing with a loved one, just dancing like nobody's watching or caring, and you're just lost within that world where the music is just so perfect and lovely it feels. Very weird, but it's just what comes to mind, of course. But yeah, to go back to the track though, it genuinely just fills me up with this really warm sense of joy, and I truly adore it as a result. From here we move on to the album's final track, track 5, or also known as Perdidad. This is 16 and a half minutes that culminates everything this entire album has been presenting to us in this truly phenomenal, gorgeous finale that stretches out for such a beautifully long time. So immediately from the onset, you get these vocalizations, this twirling of dense, gentle piano notes, and then what I would assume is like maybe the sound of a harmonica or an accordion. I don't know, of course. But then what you're getting is the introduction of this beautiful vocal melody being performed by the choir. And as it progresses, more and more voices seem to join the fray as everything just warmly presents itself. And it seems to stumble and falter in places again. But it adds to the character of the composition, of course, before it all fades away, though, after this sort of short introduction. But it doesn't fade into silence, but into applause. But this isn't the end of the song, of course. It's only been a couple of minutes. And what it does, it leads the way for this incredibly gentle waltz to begin. The piano plays the melody, the bass begins, and the voices carry that vocal refrain so effortlessly. And from here, the whole thing just sways around so beautifully as you fall back into the gentle sounds being offered by both the choir and the performers. Goodness, I think this is a truly beautiful and in many ways an incredibly special track. And it's a lovely thing for this whole album to have slowly built itself up towards. So for starters, the instrumental layers just come across so nicely on this one, with the piano and even an acoustic guitar just continuing to push the song along, which then becomes punctuated by the bass and drums that create that very gentle pulse. But all the while, the choir just continues to sing that repeated refrain, just climbing in the first bar, falling in the second, and it goes so low though. And then it just slowly moves itself from there, and the entire composition just seems to open up so far and wide, giving so much room to the composition and just so much space for the individuals to just become the soloists for just the briefest of moments, Like, for example, sometimes you hear a voice just vocalize a variation, or the piano just encircle a couple of notes here and there, or even just the whoop from somebody that happens once in this track though. Just clearly lost within the incredibly joyous vibes being presented by everyone. Like, I think it's beautiful. There's something so just glorious, especially when the voices climb so high above the rest, bringing with it such a genuine sense of warmth and just unity as well. For me, it continues that incredibly waltzy quality that is dominant in so many of these songs. And once again, it reminds me of dancing. It reminds me of dancing in Disney films for some reason. The princess and the prince just dancing away for some reason. I don't know why. It has nothing to do with this album, but it's just the images that come to my head every time I hear this one. But I think it's a truly beautiful track though, and simply put, a perfect way to end this album as well. Like, you really get the sense of community coming through so brilliantly on this one. Everyone simply coming together, not to do anything, brilliant or amazing, but just to present, just to sing with each other, if that makes sense, just to perform with each other and to capture that beautiful moment in time with each other, if that makes sense. It's a truly glorious thing. So, yeah, what an album. I have to say, this is one of those albums I've become a little bit obsessed with, truth be told, since it being recommended to us by our commenter. But there's just something so wonderful and lovely about the presentation of music like this, even if I can't exactly put my finger on why exactly. I'll try my best to explain, rather badly as I always do, of course. But I think, for me, what it is, it's the sense of community that's present in these recordings, So the idea that in this incredibly exceptional circumstance where Isaac Sundstrom was just in Mexico, ended up meeting the right people at the right time. The local choir, the Haitian soloist, and their time spent together, however long it may have been, resulted in them all performing music that is just so beautiful and transcendental, and at its very core, just incredibly human. And perhaps that's why I'm obsessed with it. Is that embedded deep within, this very music we're hearing are real people performing because they want to perform, and they're just expressing love and unity with each other, if that makes sense. What an incredibly special thing for them all to have captured under very peculiar and unusual circumstances. It's truly beautiful. And so, before we close off though, there is a sort of important point I do want to mention though, that I think, it's worth mentioning when it comes to an album like this. And I will say here, I think this is where the cynicism comes through. So I do apologise, but at the same time, I think this is very important to mention, because this does genuinely confuse me on some level. So, in my research for this album, I came across an incredibly well-written review by one Danny Weiser for 200 World Albums. And in his review, he of course discusses in great detail the beauty and the pathos of this record. But they also raise a very relevant concern. So much of this album is shrouded in mystery, purposely shrouded in mystery. With even the story being this incredibly vague, explanation consisting of just a simple statement that Isaac Sundstrom returned from Mexico, having met the Haitian soloist in the Mexican choir, with the very album that we're hearing. And what Weiser mentions in their review is, in detail of how this album is, devoid of any direct information. There's no names of those involved on the recording, whether they're performers or helping in the production. And we have absolutely none of that information, which of course raises a lot of questions. But perhaps the most salient and oddly depressing point that Weiser mentions is whether or not this purposeful anonymity means that the very performers were being exploited in some way or form. Weiser does go on to mention rather beautifully, though, that this record is perhaps not about finding the literal truth of things, but just accepting existence for what it is. And they've worded it incredibly well, and it's worth reading their review. There is a link of it in the description below. But I can't understand why there would be a reason for Isaac Sundtram to not have credited the performers on this record. On Bandcamp, on Discog, the only mention of anyone's involvement in the record is of Isaac himself. And so what is the reasoning for that? Did the choir not want to be credited? In a hopeful scenario, that would be the case. I would certainly hope so, that maybe it's just a case that they didn't want to be credited, they just wanted to perform it, and, it was irrelevant to them. But we don't know that. We don't know anything. And it does concern me, because the idea of these people not being compensated for something so beautiful kind of sucks to me, if that makes sense. So yeah, it's maybe a bit cynical of me to mention all, but I feel like it's important though. Like sometimes when you come across something beautiful, there is this kind of darker side to it, and maybe it does put a darkening gloom over the entire album experience, but I do think it's important to consider. Regardless though, the mystery, the anonymity, the incredibly vague story, it does in a weird way contribute in some part to the very beauty of this album experience which at its very core literally presents this incredibly wonderful music performed by these unknown people, whomever they are. And it's just lovely that they all did come together, regardless of the situation or the hows and whys. They did come together to sing these songs, to perform them, and just present something greater than themselves. And maybe that's what's important. Not the who's and the what's and the specifics of everything, but rather the literal sounds that we hear. And did Sundtram exploit these people? Maybe. We don't know, do we? We don't know. But did this group also sing some of the most beautiful devotional music we've now heard? That's a definite yes in my books. And regardless of how this album truly came about, the fact is, this is an album that exists exactly for what it is. Hopefully that makes some semblance of sense to you viewers at home, and you kind of see why I want to raise this point as kind of, as grim as it can be. But, regardless of it, it is a beautiful album. And essentially, it does give me a lot to think about. But I do appreciate the incredibly raw, beautiful DIY aesthetic, and just the pure sound that emanates across the 5 recordings on this album. And, it exists for exactly what it is, and that is a truly beautiful thing in a weird way. And so, yeah, I think with that, we might as well come to the end of our episode of Weird Music there. Very interesting album, and one that I do really appreciate the raw, exquisite beauty of, which, like as mentioned, it presents itself for what it is, and nothing more. And yes, perhaps cynical to have raised the concern, but it does concern me nonetheless. And I think we shouldn't try to shy away from things that are a bit awkward to discuss sometimes. Because, as difficult as it is, we can still appreciate this album for what it is, which is a literal document of all these people coming together to present this beautiful music. Because at the end of the day, this is an incredibly beautiful album. And these performers, whoever they may have been, should be praised for their wonderful music. And so, yeah, with that, I would like to thank you for watching this very odd episode of Weird Music. A huge thanks to Renato for recommending me this one. Easily one of my favourite things I've been sent by the wonderful audience of Weird Music. So you have my appreciation in this one. I truly appreciate it. Thank you. And so yeah, hopefully as this year goes on, we'll get through a couple more of these requested videos. We'll try our best anyway. It's all we can do. Anyway, with that, I would like to thank you for watching today's episode of Weird Music. I wish you all the best, take care, and bye-bye for now. Bye bye.